On the 60th anniversary of the signing of the armistice that marked the end of open hostilities in the Korean War, activists from around the world gather in Seoul, Pyongyang, and Tokyo to discuss the way forward toward peace and reunification on the Korean peninsula. This is the GRTV Backgrounder on Global Research TV. This is James Corbett for Global Research TV in Seoul, South Korea in July 2013, as we approach the 60th anniversary of the signing of the armistice that ended the Korean War. But the Korean War never really ended, of course. It was just put on hold. The war itself lasted 3 years from 1950 to 1953, with both sides, the Republic of Korea in the south, backed primarily by the US, and the DPRK in the north with significant military support from Communist China, storming across the 38th parallel dividing north and south, only to be beaten back after vicious fighting. The armistice bringing an end to open hostilities between the combatants was signed on July 27, 1953, by U.S. Army Lieutenant General William Harrison Jr. and North Korean General Nam Il. It established the 38th parallel, originally created as the demarcation line between the US-occupied South and the Soviet-occupied North during the post-war US military command of Korea, as the official border between the North and South. It established a 2.5-mile-wide buffer zone known as the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, which to this day remains the most heavily defended border in the world, and it committed both sides to pursuing negotiations in expectation of a peace treaty to formally end the war. And yet even now, 60 years after the war concluded, no such peace treaty has been signed. Over 28,000 US troops are still deployed in South Korea, ready to resume combat with North Korea. And the Korean nation remains divided along an arbitrary line on a map, splitting families from their ancestral homelands and creating yet another rift in a nation that has been conquered, ruled, occupied, and divided throughout much of its history. On the surface, the casual observer of Korea could be forgiven for forgetting that the nation is still at war. The South has been utterly transformed since the days of the fighting, with the impressive skyline of modern-day Seoul reflecting the country's modern, high-tech economy. Even the DMZ has been tamed and gentrified, with souvenir shops and tourist attractions mingling seamlessly with military personnel whose presence at times seems more ceremonial than operational. But beneath that surface remains the deep, lingering scars of a nation divided against itself, and the memories of a bitter, brutal war. Now, 60 years after the signing of the armistice, Korean peace activists are working harder than ever to confront the myths that have propped up and maintained this state of war, spearheading an effort to finally bring real peace to the Korean peninsula. One such initiative was a recent international symposium which brought together peace activists, scholars, journalists, and concerned citizens to events in Seoul, Pyongyang, and Tokyo, all with the aim of confronting the enabling myths of the Korean War and working toward a peace treaty. The symposium took place around the 60th anniversary of the armistice and included the participation of Unified Progressive Party leader Jung-hee Lee and the Korean Alliance for Progressive Movements, as well as scholars like Professor Michel Chossudovsky of the Center for Research on Globalization, Professor Kyo Chung of Tsinghua University in Beijing, journalist Shang Lei of CCTV in China, activist Brian Becker of the Answer Coalition in Washington, and former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark.
I'm more concerned with the human side of matters in life than I am geopolitical and military and things like that. And one of the most heartbreaking stories that I know of my time, and that's a long time, is the division of the Korean family and the Korean people. I can't tell you how much the pain has waned, but I can tell you it's still enormous, still omnipresent. They're a beautiful people. They're entitled to have one country. They'd had one language and one culture uniquely. I remember as a kid when I was in college studying what countries had the single most united culture, and Korea was number one. It had the longest history of same language, same people, predominantly in the region, literature, or poetry, and all that kind of stuff. Tanzania, which I also love, is last. It had so many tribal and other divisions that you couldn't imagine them all living in the same place. But the greatest danger to peace in the world, in a major way, may be in this area. You have China and Russia, Japan, enormous power, enormous military capacity. The United States is here too, right in the middle of it in South Korea. Whenever they need to get there, they can get there fast and in large numbers.
Some of the myths that this symposium worked to deconstruct included the fundamental myth of the legitimacy of the war itself. The war effort in the South has long been characterized as a UN-led effort taking place under a United Nations command that was authorized by UN Security Council Resolution 83.
The prompt action of the United Nations to put down lawless aggression and the prompt response to this action by free peoples all over the world will stand as a landmark in mankind's long search for a rule of law among nations.
The legitimacy of this resolution has been challenged on several levels. In direct violation of Article 32 of the UN Charter, North Korea was not invited to participate in the Security Council deliberations on the dispute. The conflict was beyond the scope of UN action, as the North-South border skirmishes that drew UN attention was a civil war, and thus an internal matter beyond the mandate of UN intervention. And the Soviet Union boycotted the Security Council resolution, invalidating the action in the eyes of many legal scholars. Even more fundamentally, the UN never in fact established a formal United Nations command for the fighting. Security Council Resolution 83 merely called on member states to provide assistance to the South Koreans, but the so-called UN command was always primarily a US military effort, a point conceded by former UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali.
I'd like to spend my time on this very issue. Is another hidden issue for 60 years, which is the illegality of using the name, the UN command, quote, and quote, in Korea, ever since the US has falsely justified its military and strategic agenda, both in Korean Peninsula and the Northeast Asian region, by wearing the United Nations command hat. The offices of two former UN Secretary Generals, Boutros Boutros-Ghali and Kofi Annan, and the present sitting UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, all three UN General Secretary have categorically denied and pointed out the illegality of the US military presence in the name of, quote, the UN command in Korea. Let me quote from the UN office. The United States, without any authority from the United Nations, changed the name of, I quote, unified command, unquote. It was to direct to the name, I quote, the UN command, unquote. This change falsifies the nature of the US role in the Korean War and in the armistice, making it appear that the US is acting under the authority of the United Nations, unquote. However, the decision made by what is called the UN command is made by the United States. The US is not acting, I quote, as a subsidiary or representative of the UN when it acts under the name of the UN command, unquote. Yet, the false appearance given is that the US is acting under the authority of the United Nations. Therefore, the UN as a whole has even asked the US to resolve the issue of illegality and illegally and falsely used the name, the UN command. So in November 1975, the resolution number 3390B was passed by the UN General Assembly calling for negotiations between the relevant parties so that the U.S. would no longer use the misleading designation UN command to represent the U.S. military role. However, as you know, as I know, as we know, the U.S. has not fulfilled on the obligation to carry out these negotiations.
The nuclear threat to the Korean Peninsula was also a topic of discussion. Completely counter to the Western narrative, however, which posits North Korea's estimated 6 to 8 nuclear devices and lack of intercontinental delivery system as some sort of existential threat to the United States, attendees stressed that the real nuclear threat is, and always has, come from Washington.
Now, if we put this in the broader perspective, there's what I call an asymmetry in nuclear weapons capabilities between the United States and North Korea. They are, according to the most recent data, more than 5,000 US warheads stockpiled and deployed. Not all of them are deployed. Out of those 5,000, there are more than 1,600 strategic nuclear warheads which are deployed, and there are another 500 so-called tactical nuclear weapons. I should explain that a tactical nuclear weapon is called a mini-nuke, but they're not so small as what they appear to be. They have an explosive capacity between 1/3 and 6 times a Hiroshima bomb. There's another 500 of those. So what we have is 2,000, over 2,000 nuclear bombs are currently targeted, and they are targeted against North Korea. They're also targeted against a number of other countries. Because in other words, it's the principle of multiple targeting. So you have 2,000 nuclear weapons which are targeted and which are deployed, okay, out of approximately 5,600 if I count the tactical nuclear weapons. So we're talking about an arsenal, a formidable arsenal. And the question we have to ask ourselves, who is the military threat? Who is the threat? Where does the threat come from? From North Korea or from the United States of America? That is the important question to be raised. If I look at the same sources, the same data bank and sources which provide the information on the US nuclear weapons program, the statement is as follows. The DPRK, according to the same source, has separated enough plutonium for roughly 4 to 8 nuclear warheads, but there's no evidence that North Korea has the means to actually deliver these nuclear weapons, and it has not, according to expert opinion, North Korea does not yet have much of a nuclear arsenal because it lacks fissile material and has limited nuclear testing experience, and its capabilities to deliver these weapons are virtually nil, okay, in a meaningful way. And of course, if you read the newspapers, we get exactly the opposite, that North Korea's attack on America is imminent, but yet none of these newspapers have the honesty to review the history and acknowledge that the US nuclear weapons program directed against Korea started 63 years ago in 1950, and in a more active way in 1956, but we're talking about more than half a century of nuclear warheads and threats and war games, which are well understood, and consequently this latest saga of accusations directed at North Korea is a clear case of media disinformation and double standards.
Given these facts, and given its history of scuttling attempts at serious peace negotiations, consensus at the symposium emerged around the notion that Washington and its 28,000 in-country troops are the single greatest impediment to peace on the Korean peninsula.
In the last months of the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright, the then Secretary of State, was dispatched to Pyongyang. There was the June 15th summit between North and South Korea. There was great optimism, I would say even in some quarters a euphoria that the Korean War was finally in 1999 coming to an end, that there could be a reduction of tension, that there could be a lifting of economic sanctions against the DPRK, the removal of the tens of thousands of U.S. troops from South Korea, and normalization of relations between the U.S. and the DPRK. Normal relations. Wars begin, they take place, and eventually they come to an end. And when they come to an end, a new day starts. It appeared that the Clinton administration was on the verge, the cusp of making a change. And then George W. Bush came into office, and in March 2001, he greeted Kim Dae-jung, the president of South Korea, in the most rude, disrespectful, and negative way, sending a message that the new administration, the Bush administration, would scrap any prospects for peace between the U.S. and DPRK. And then Bush, in his State of the Union message in 2002, declared that DPRK and Iran and Iraq are an axis of evil, and proceeded to invade and destroy Iraq. If you're the government of the DPRK, you can only come to one conclusion, that you must do everything in your power to defend your country from what appears to be inevitable new war coming from the greatest military superpower in the world. And that's precisely what the DPRK did. It resumed its nuclear program, it went into a war footing, and the next decade has been characterized by the scrapping of any possibilities of peace. Politics. Politics in 1999, almost the possibility of normalization, and politics in 2001. Where are those politics originating from? Not in Seoul, not in Pyongyang, but in Washington, D.C.
As part of the events marking the 60th anniversary of the armistice, the symposium mounted a protest at the doorstep of the demilitarized zone, including speeches from a range of international speakers, like Andy Hu of Fourth Media in Beijing.
We all know that the Korean War not just divided North and South Korea, but also contributed to postponing the reunification of China. And there are also those who suspect that the Chinese position to combat imperialism has shifted. And some say that that China itself has become the aggressor in many aspects. And we're here to tell you that spirit has not been lost, and that the Chinese people still do firmly oppose all acts of aggression here or in any part of the world.
Events also included a march and rally outside the Yongsan U.S. Army garrison in central Seoul.
As an American, I say, for South Korea to be a sovereign country, this joint command has to end.
미국 시민으로서 한반도가 자주권을 찾으려면 이러한 불평등한 관계는 반드시 끝장나야 합니다.
And as an American, I must support Korea's right to determine its own future free from foreign influence.
그리고 또 미국 시민으로서 한반도가 외국의 지배에서 해방될 수 있는 자주적 권리를 지지합니다.
The first step is an end to this joint command.
그리고 첫 단계에는 여기 한미 연합 사령부가 반드시 없어져야 합니다.
And as someone who voted for President Obama,
그리고 저는 오바마 대통령을 선거에서 뽑긴 했지만
I plead that President Obama open negotiations for a peace agreement with North Korea to end the Korean War.
평화 협정을 위한 협상을 반드시 즉각 시작해야 합니다.
We must have a peace agreement to end the Korean War, and we must end the U.S. command, and we must get U.S. troops out of Korea.
전쟁을 끝내고 평화 협정을 체결하고 그리고 미군은 즉각 몰아내야 합니다.
The day culminated in a candlelight vigil that drew 20,000 people out to Seoul Plaza for an overwhelming display of solidarity amongst Koreans truly interested in peace and reunification. As this anniversary too passes, and yet another year without peace in Korea is added to the calendar, the Korean people increasingly take up the mantle of beginning the process of healing by themselves. It will be a long and difficult road, complicated by interference from all of the outside parties with a stake in using the Korean War as an excuse to militarize the region. But for this very reason, it is important that peace is not delayed any longer. The people of Korea, the people of the Asia-Pacific, and indeed, the people of the world, can't wait any longer. James Corbett, Global Research TV, Seoul. For more on this story and other breaking news and current events, please go to globalresearch.ca. For more research and analysis by James Corbett, please go to corbettreport.com. The Center for Research on Globalization depends on your support. To purchase a book or DVD, or to make a donation, please visit globalresearch.ca today.